Just last week, this show's producer was in contact with a Kenyan activist and sometimes politician Boniface Mwangi about potentially coming on this week's episode of Global Insights on the Lead. My colleague Kwangu, who hosts the show, had been looking into producing an episode on how governments in East Africa are cracking down on dissent. Mwangi had been arrested in Tanzania whilst making a visit in support of an opposition politician there, and alleges he was tortured and sexually assaulted in custody. Mwangi was cordial when we contacted him, but he didn't want to speak, perhaps understandably. He was, he said, still recovering from his ordeal in Tanzania. Then, just a few days later, Mwangi was arrested again, this time by Kenyan authorities, who initially looked to charge him with facilitating terrorist acts. Kwangu joins me now. Kwangu, Mwangi's case is certainly alarming, but it reflects the wider issue in the region of this extraordinary crackdown that seems to be affecting not only Kenya, but also Tanzania and even their neighbor Uganda. It's very much a story affecting the whole of East Africa.
Absolutely, Faisal. It's in Uganda as well. We're getting stories out of Uganda about this cross-border abuse, especially of human rights activists.
Right. But that wasn't the only indicator you had of this creeping government repression whilst you were trying to bring guests onto the show, right?
Absolutely. So I invited Maria Sarungi-Tsehai. Now, she's a prominent Tanzanian activist. She was abducted by armed men in Kenya, and she was released after several hours. So she's really had her fair share of being manhandled by suspected state operatives. Now, what was interesting about her was that she tried to join us for the recording of the podcast on our usual recording platform, but it gave her a very hard time to get in. She kept on getting this 403 error, which basically means access has been forbidden. And that made us wonder if it was some kind of a block by the authorities. But eventually she found a way of joining us.
Yeah, I mean, the podcast software that we use is a very, very well-known piece of software. So the idea that they're banning that makes you wonder what else they might be banning. Who else joined you on this week's episode?
So my other guest is Mary Kambo from the Kenyan Human Rights Commission. Now, her organization is also no stranger to violence. Just earlier on this month, there was a press conference where armed men stormed into that press conference and typically just harassed all the people who were attending that press conference. They were talking about, the Human Rights Commission in that press conference was talking about human rights abuses and what's happening in the region. She categorically believes that the attackers are connected to government.
That's very interesting. I mean, it's good, I think, that we're covering these stories in the moment that they are happening, because it does sound like it's a signal of a wider crackdown that isn't just limited to one country. Well, it sounds like it'll be a fascinating, if a troubling episode. Let's hear what Mary and Maria had to say.
Sure. Here's this week's episode of Global Insights on the Lead. So across East Africa, there's a sense that civil space is shrinking. From arrests and abductions to death in custody, governments seem increasingly intolerant of criticism. Today, I'm joined by two women who know this terrain very well. Mary and Maria, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
So I will start with you, Maria. Earlier this year, you were abducted in Nairobi by armed men, and you were held for several hours before being released. This incident shocked a lot of people, and not just because of what happened to you, but because it raised serious questions about how far state intimidation can reach. What did that experience show you about the risks activists face today, and what keeps you from going on despite these risks?
I think that primarily when it comes to risk, the fact that it has become cross-border is really terrifying. There is, of course, absolute evidence of some form of collaboration. We don't know at what level, but definitely some of the abductors were Kenyan, based on the accent, based on a number of factors that I could discern. Although I was blindfolded, and of course I was under intense pressure, but I do think that there was a level of collaboration. What is more scary is that these abductions have been on the rise. Primarily, I have been tracking it very closely in Tanzania, where for a couple of years now, the abductions have increased. We now have a list that we've been compiling with a number of human rights defenders. And what we found was that we have close to 200 that we know of. And there is so much more. Every day, I just keep getting news about abductions. Out of that, more than half of them have not been seen again, including about 3 or 4 of them who turned up dead. The police keep denying it. As recently as yesterday, the head of police for the Dar es Salaam region denied that the police are not involved. But however, almost 80% of the cases, relatives report that the people who come to take them away, abduct them by force, or even at gunpoint, usually claim to be police. They're armed, they have handcuffs, and they have vehicles, although with fake plate numbers, but resembling that. With my experience as well, when I was held as a hostage, they kept insisting that they're police. But of course, clearly, after I was released, it was clear that they were not official police. But that is the cover that they use. Whether now we can prove that they're really police, they're rogue, they've been sent, it's a sanctioned operation. Of course, there is a state sanction at some level, because the level of abduction and the brazen act of such abductions is definitely somewhere state sanctioned. At what level, that is what is becoming very difficult to prove.
Okay, so you have said at some level it is state sanctioned, and you also talked about collaborations regionally. Just expand on that for us, please.
Well, there are several cases, of course, we've seen, particularly in Kenya, of some foreign nationals who have been taken off the streets. But one, I think, incident which has turned up to be very serious was that of Kizza Besigye, who was taken in Nairobi, abducted the same way. And strangely enough, he turned up in a prison in Uganda. At that point, the question is going to be, how did they transport him all across Kenya, cross him over to the border, get him to Uganda without anyone realizing? Of course, again, as I say, there could be a lower level of collaboration. In my case, there were times when I could hear what sounded more like a roadblock, whereby they would silence me, they would push me down, they would threaten me to inflict more harm if I speak up. So it's not necessarily that it's a whole coordinated operation, but the reason I say it's state sanctioned is that there has to be at some point whereby any given government would be outraged and want explanation from the other government. However, all these governments are silent about whatever is happening in neighboring countries regarding their own citizens or vice versa. So for what I think is the loudest is the silence.
And just another case that comes to mind, of course, is that of Boniface Mwangi, one of Kenya's most well-known activists. He was abducted in Tanzania with Ugandan activist Agatha Atuhaire. They wanted to attend Tundu Lissu's treason trial. Now, they say they were held incommunicado for 4 days. They say they were tortured and sexually assaulted. Now, that's a pretty big step taken by Tanzanian authorities, wasn't it? I mean, to arrest 2 foreign nationals in this way?
So one of the things that I would say that it's shocking, but it is not surprising seeing the trend that they took before. And because, again, there was no real slapping on the wrist of whatever has happened, whether it has happened to me, it has happened to, hundreds of Tanzanians, the international community, the United Nations, the Africa Union, everybody has remained quiet relatively. The UN Working Group, the UN Special Rapporteur are the ones who have been speaking out, but that is not good enough. There has to be a level of outrage about such actions. Now, what happened with Boniface and Agatha, I think, is the pinnacle of the audacity and the impunity that the Samia Suluhu regime rules with. And the reason I'm saying that is that just 2 weeks before that, on the 24th of May, some of the Chadema, that is the opposition political party of which Tundu Lissu belongs to, some of the Chadema members went to attend the trial. What happened is they were abducted in front of the court. There is a case of a young woman who was taken inside the courtroom, ended up being hidden inside the central police station, the exact place where Agatha and Boniface were also taken, hidden, later transported and tortured. So this is not a new case. The police took these members, and we have video footage of them being put into a police vehicle, and they ended up in forests and in wilderness outside Dar es Salaam, tortured. Some had their legs broken, sexually abused, terrible things. Amnesty International has gone and taken these logs, but the victims are under severe threat. They're unable to file properly these reports. And after 2 weeks, when a number of activists, lawyers, and even some of the retired high-level Kenyan prominent people went, like Martha Karua and Dr. Mutunga, they were first denied entry. And those who managed to go into Tanzania, even some of them attend the court, among them Agatha, they were subjected to a lot of threats. We saw Boniface then being arrested. The main reason they said is that they didn't follow immigration process, but it's never made clear. They don't have anything on file. The deportation of Martha Karua, of Dr. Willie Mutunga, they were just sent back, but there is nothing. They were not given a reason. So it's impunity. They just operate in impunity, and it's really outrageous.
So, Mary, now Maria paints a very grim picture about human rights abuses in the region. And just last week, we were actually talking to Mwangi about appearing on the podcast to discuss what happened to him in Tanzania. And he understandably denied. He said, he's still recovering from that ordeal. And then, over the weekend, he was arrested by Kenyan authorities. He was initially charged with facilitation of terrorist acts, which was subsequently changed to illegal possession of ammunition. Now, first of all, tell us about this case. Your organization, the Kenya Human Rights Commission, has called these charges against him a trumped-up accusation.
Thank you, Kwangu. Now, Boniface Mwangi, a very well-known activist that Maria has clearly painted during, the torture and all that happened in Tanzania. He was arrested on the 19th of July, arrested and picked from his home. Now, the charges that are leveled against Boniface Mwangi, completely outrageous. And this is not isolated, because we have seen all the protesters that have been arrested in Kenya following all the protests that have happened since last year are now being accused with terrorism. So Boniface Mwangi, picked from home, was accused of facilitating terrorist acts, which basically terrorist acts during the protests that rocked the country from last year during the anti-finance bill protest that was staged very heavily by the Gen Zs or the young people. And now coming to part of July, where we had initially commemoration. We had commemoration of the June 25 protest, and we had also the Saba Saba protest on the 7th of July. So Boniface is being accused of paying people to stage these protests against the government. But now, while he was presented in court on Monday, he was detained within the court precincts for more than 4 hours. Boniface was within court, but not being presented or arraigned in court itself. Now, this, of course, raised a huge uproar because human rights defenders, civil society organizations, and a whole barrage of advocates were in court to show solidarity with Boniface. And so the magistrate was actually required to have Boniface Mwangi presented in court. And it was very easy to see that the prosecution was ill-equipped for presenting Boniface Mwangi to court. They had no charges to level against Boniface Mwangi. No charge sheet had been presented to the magistrate for more than 4 hours of Boniface Mwangi being in court. It actually took a lot of lobbying and agitation for a charge sheet to be quickly crafted against Boniface. And what we saw was a quick drop of the charges on, the accusation on terrorism, so that the accusation now was that he was found with ammunition without a license, and that he had also 2 tear gas canisters that were unused. So those became the new charges. And so, of course, now the agitation was also to have this matter removed from the terrorism court because the charges had been lowered. Now, what we saw against Boniface is not surprising. As I have mentioned, the young people, all of whom have been arrested during the protest, are being charged with very serious charges. And this is to make it difficult for them to be bailed out, so that they're detained in the cells for inordinate periods of time, and of course to deny them freedoms that come outside of the ambit of terrorism. So this is what we have seen. The regime has become extremely desperate. The regime has become extremely intolerant and paranoid, and we're seeing that the regime has been unable now to stand any dissent or criticism. And therefore, the arrest of Mwangi and the charges that are trumped up are not, though shocking, are not surprising, as we have seen these being now the new tactic that the regime is deploying.
Okay, ladies, now let's look into how we got here. Maria, when President Samia Suluhu Hassan took office, there was a lot of hope in Tanzania that the country was turning a corner after the late President John Magufuli years. Were you optimistic when she was sworn in? And are you still optimistic? What's happening now? Just paint a picture for us.
Well, I think the fact that just the passing of John Magufuli happened gave a lot of people a lot of hope. But for me, it was clear that it's still the same group of people. Samia Suluhu was the vice president of Magufuli. She's a CCM member. She was there all the step of the way. She vied for re-election as the running mate of Magufuli. So honestly, I was skeptical from day one, and I always pointed out that it is a very good turning point if she is ready to give and to act on reforms through tangible action. What has happened is there's been a lot of positive rhetoric that she's been very good at. She's been able to portray herself as a person who is looking for reconciliation with the opposition. She used a lot of lovely terms, and she used the word reform very often. But the truth of the fact is there were repressive laws that she never, ever changed. So every time I tried to track whatever change has happened, she did not do any tangible change. On top of that, she also said that she was going to bring about electoral reforms, which was the first step toward getting a more democratic institution within parliament and other areas. And what she did instead is just to bring a law that is far more repressive and then do such gimmicks like rename the National Electoral Commission to Independent National Electoral Commission while it's still being appointed by her, by the president. The president appoints every commissioner, including the chair of the Electoral Commission. And she's the incumbent and she's also the candidate. So it's ridiculous. Getting, I think in a nutshell, what is happening in Tanzania, it's a 60-plus year dictatorship that started off with some reform, and then somewhere 10, 15 years ago, the reforms threatened the grip of CCM on power, and therefore what happened immediately was more and more repression. And we're seeing a downward spiral. It's going to get worse before we get any relief on the repression that we experience in Tanzania. And we're seeing that because we're seeing that they've shut down, for example, the internet. Twitter is not accessible without VPN. Telegram has not been accessible for 6-7 months. And Clubhouse, strangely, because it's very much preferred by the diaspora, has been unreachable without a VPN for over a year. So this kind of shutdown will continue. Recently, one of the CCM members and a prominent member and a former ambassador was speaking out criticizing Samia Suluhu's candidacy. They shut down YouTube for a couple of hours and even throttled the internet and tried to shut down his live stream on Facebook. So it is really getting to a point whereby now the oppression and the repression is escalating to a point where we'll start seeing full-blown dictatorship, something that CCM has been pretty good at hiding and sort of masking into a soft image that they always do. So it's an iron fist in a velvet glove.
Now, she's the first woman in Tanzania to be president. She's also the first Muslim woman head of state in Africa. And that means quite a bit symbolically, right? But you've just painted a picture for us that there's no real change. And then it's just basically a downward spiral in the country. But what does this mean when Africa's first female Muslim president is accused of overseeing the same repressive system she's expected to reform? And what does it mean when the face of repression is female?
I think it's very unfortunate, and I've been on the forefront of warning against that. I did talk about a historic moment that she could have stepped into and taken this to a level whereby women can prove, that they're competent and able to run countries. I think what she has done is so detrimental, and the biggest mistake has been when a lot of people started equating possible reforms that they projected onto her with her gender. And I remember I kept saying that being a woman is not a qualification. And I did actually have fallouts with some of the people who are my friends and feminists. And they kept saying, Maria, you're wrong. You're not supposed to attack her because she's a woman. She's learning on the job and some outrageous things that they said. But I think very early on, from 2021, she immediately showed extreme repression with the people of Ngorongoro, who are overwhelmingly from the Maasai community, by trying to forcibly move them out. Some were moved out from their area in Loliondo, and then she started denying them basic social services. And I said that even if it would be a male president, female, it doesn't matter. It is so heartless to say that you deprive health and education from a community because you want to force them out of the land. And that in itself is so outrageous that I kept telling people not to equate whatever she does with her gender. Now, that is true for the achievements, and that should be also true for whatever shortcomings she has. The problem is if you've already started praising her on the basis of her gender, then there's no way you can get away with the fact, which we're seeing now more and more voiced by Tanzanians, where they say they will never, ever elect a female president because female presidents are what Samia Suluhu is. And that, I think, is so detrimental. We have been working very hard in sort of showing the face of women in the struggle for democracy and in many other fronts. She came in calling herself a reformist, trying to claim that spot, and she messed up big time. So we are going to have a very hard uphill battle as women, especially when it comes to democracy and rule of law, to really try to prove our point that women are just as much capable to be able to rule democratically and also to be leaders just in itself. So I think it's been very detrimental, both for Tanzania and for Africa.
Mary, what is your take on Samia Suluhu?
Yeah, I agree entirely with what Maria has said. It's quite unfortunate because when we have usually presented the candidature of women, we've had a candidate, a female candidate a few years ago, Martha Karua, and we want to show that the women will have a different side to them. So when we have a woman coming into power and turning around and becoming even worse than the dictators that we have had in regimes, is completely unacceptable. It is completely outrageous, because what it does is that many people who had a lot of faith in female leadership at the top level, as Suluhu is holding, have now of course, developed cold feet, and Suluhu will make it extremely difficult for other women to ascend to that level of political power because of rolling back on the few gains that civil society organizations have been able to record, but also really coming in and becoming a worse-off dictator. Because what we have seen with the Suluhu regime is that the dictatorial tendencies are bolder, they are tougher, and they're actually more pronounced now. It's worse than we have seen. And I don't know. I actually see that there is a culture and a tendency for the region now to be exchanging notes, because what is happening in Tanzania is a replica of what we're going through in Kenya. We have seen Uganda being even in a worse off state, and Kenya was a forerunner in the region in terms of democracy and good governance. Unfortunately, all this has been rolled back with the regimes that are currently in power, and Suluhu unfortunately has not made the situation in Tanzania any better.
And Mary, just picking up on what's happening in Kenya, just last month, a political blogger, Albert Ojwang, died in police custody. This sparked nationwide protests with many from the younger generation. They were really protesting on the streets. Now, tell us why this case has moved so many people, and what do you think this case, as well as the recent arrest of Mwangi, says about how Kenya is dealing with its own dissenters?
The case of Albert Ojwang is completely heart-wrenching. A young teacher, 31 years old, is picked by police more than 350 kilometers away from the capital city and driven all the way to the capital, locked up in the cells, and before we know it, death in custody has occurred. So Albert is arrested. He's tortured. He goes through gruesome, untold torture. And in fact, when he was picked, because of the abductions that have been happening since the protest of last year, 2024, the Gen Z protest against the finance bill, when he's arrested, his parents actually ask the policeman, "Will our son be safe in your hands?" And the policemen confirm that the young man will be safe. They even pretend to exchange contacts to confirm that they have taken charge and the young man will be safe. Albert himself makes calls to his friends and says, "I have never been arrested. Will I be safe?" The question of safety in the hands of police was coming because we had seen so many young men from 2024 being arrested. Some have never been found after the protests of last year. Some were tortured, left for the dead, and others, of course, locked up in trumped-up charges. So Albert is arrested. He's booked in at the station at 9:30 p.m. He is even allowed to speak to his wife. And the following day, his father leaves and travels all the way 350 kilometers, carrying the family's only title deed to come and bail out his son. He reaches the police station, kept waiting for many hours, and then he is slapped with the horrific news that your son died from self-inflicted injuries. Now, Albert was tortured to death. When his wife saw the body in the morgue, she said she had never seen a body like that one. It was like what we see in the movies. What this is telling us, because Albert's case is not the first, unfortunately, we've had a number of young people who have been arrested, who have been tortured, people who have been disappeared. Their families do not know their fate. Why it sparked a lot of uproar and a lot of protests. And in fact, there was a huge protest that broke countrywide, protesting the killing of these young men. It's because it was such a chilling reminder of a regime that has refused to listen to its people, a regime that has become completely intolerant to dissent. Albert was arrested purportedly for some social media posts that he had made against the Deputy Inspector General of Police, accusing him of being the wealthiest policeman and all that. So he was accused of insulting a police boss, and this is what led to his death. Young people, having gone through this last year in 2024 from the protest, were starkly reminded that the government is the same, the government won't budge, the government has not changed, and the government has decided to use all ways possible to silence dissent and alternative voices. And that is why people came out in huge numbers to protest against this, because it was like reliving the memories, the ugly memories of 2024. Unfortunately, Albert is gone. Many others have died now following. And actually, the very ironical position is that when people were on the streets protesting against the killing of Albert Ojwang, several others were killed on that day, including a mask vendor shot at close range by a police officer for being on the streets, simply hawking masks to protesters who were covering themselves from tear gas. So, I mean, we're seeing a regime that has become completely out of touch with the reality, completely disconnected from the people, and one that has decided to cling to power by all means possible, unfortunately.
Now, Maria, both you and Mary have painted a very grim picture of what's happening in East Africa. So I just wanted to find out from you, how do you think these recent actions fit into the regional trends of clamping down on political freedoms in this region? Is this a new wave of repression, or is it something that's, it's just become more visible now?
I think primarily this is something that is not new, but it is impunity. And impunity is built over time. People don't wake up and just feel that they can get away with abductions and killings. However, it is almost like building up immunity to breaking the rule of law. And I think that is where we're seeing East Africa headed more and more. And we are becoming also as citizens a little bit more and more immune to some of the impunity and some of the beatings, some of the torture, the disappearances. And this is what I think some of us have been accused of, that we are continuously reminding the society and raising the consciousness of people. I always say that we are like the canary in the coal mine. We are reminding people that what is happening is not acceptable. And I think that is where we become a threat. What East Africa needs overall, I think the entire region, maybe even up to Southern Africa, because we are seeing more and more of that spreading that way as well, is to be able to have a collective citizen declaration to say that enforced disappearance has to become not only crimes against humanity in a faraway place like The Hague in ICC or in the United Nations in New York or in Geneva, but it has to be the Africa Union has to make a declaration that enforced disappearance is crimes against humanity. Any government that practices it has to be ostracized. What we're seeing, the African Union is actually providing sanction to some of the most horrendous acts that are committed by regimes, by not being able to speak up, by treating them as if they are, they're just, some really acceptable leaders, giving them positions to head different bodies and stuff like that. We need to stop that, and we need definitely to have what I would call a citizen solidarity across the region. This is something that we're trying to build, although we are seeing more and more, as I think Mary very well put, trying to link any sort of civil resistance as terrorism and trying to criminalize it, but we can never give up. We have to keep pushing, and we must never tire.
Just picking up on that point you've just made about the Africa Union turning a blind eye to what's happening, I wonder if either of you think that there's a connection between this climate of increasing repression and wider geopolitical changes. There's very little pushback, for example, even from major international players like the United States with Donald Trump back in the White House. Have you noticed a change in the amount of support you've been getting from international actors?
I think that there is a narrative that has been built, not only in the U.S. And not only Donald Trump, but I think just in the West in general, in West and developed democracies, about what they call the threat of China. And they keep coming up with the fact that, we are peddling things like values, human rights and democracy, while China is gaining a foothold in Africa. They're getting all the rare minerals. They're gaining access to resources, which they also want. And that is becoming a serious discussion. repression. I think that one of the things that I have used whenever I'm trying to make any sense to Western and developed democracies is I tell them, why should we enjoy less rights as citizens than you do in your own home country? Of course, now they do come up with things like, even in our own country, we are facing similar challenges, but you cannot compare in any way what is happening in this part of the world to what is happening in the democracies. You cannot vote out in a country like Tanzania, CCM, if you are just going to use whatever, method they've been using, like campaigning, because there's never even an election. So we need to be able to tell developed democracies, okay, this is not your mess, I agree, but do not help. Do not give foreign aid. Do not give investment. Do not propagate these regimes' financial interests. Stay away. If you have decided that this is not your fight, then stay away completely. Even if you don't intervene, then stay away completely. These regimes depend heavily on what I call free money, because they still give a lot of aid. Yes, USAID is no longer giving that kind of money. They come in the form of investment. And for that reason, I think even the influence has been reduced in Africa. But when it comes to other nations like the European Union and some of the Scandinavian countries, they're giving hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to all these countries, and they're not asking much in return. So I think that has to change. And what has to happen is for them to understand the citizens of Africa and whichever other country, particular country you want to name, have just as much right to enjoy, freedoms the way they enjoy it in their own countries.
Now, Mary, with that in mind, I wonder how you see this getting better. Is this part of a global trend in which rights are steadily being eroded? If so, what can be done to address this?
Indeed, I think it's really a global trend, because what we see happening in Kenya is actually happening within the region. We're seeing those tendencies in Tanzania. Uganda is probably even worse off. Many other countries are struggling with governance issues across not just Africa, but across the world. We've seen these in many places. Now, I think what the saving grace for getting out of the situation is that we have an increasingly bold population. For example, young people have decided that they will not live in the same situation as their fathers and their forefathers. Young people have decided, and Kenya is a very good example of what is happening with the young people, that they will take revolution in their hands. They will lead in bringing change. Democratic governance is not something that has to be negotiated anymore, but it has to happen. So we are seeing many bold people coming up and fighting autocratic regimes. We've seen the protests that have happened in Kenya since last year, and even with the suppression and the repression we have seen from the regime, that has not dampened the spirit and the quest for human rights, democracy, and good governance. I think the fact that there's a group of people that is still willing to wake up every day and say that this cannot happen, this cannot continue to happen, it's a relief to know that we still have a fighting spirit remaining amongst the people. And therefore, regimes that have decided to retain power by all means really must know that it cannot be business as usual. It's going to be different. We've seen people dying. We've seen young people saying, what do I have to lose? And so this is the spirit that is sweeping across many countries, and therefore it will not be business as usual.
You've been listening to Global Insights on the Lead. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Kwangu Liwewe. For a deeper understanding of global news and current affairs, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app, where you will find Global Insights the last Friday of every month.